Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you another tour of the garden here, show you how the vegetables are doing. Now it's been quite a while since my last update, so you'll notice a huge amount of growth on a lot of the plants and it's looking really quite nice and lush outside. But I'll start off in the polytunnel because it's raining today and it's nice and cool in there, so I'll be able to film without the camera steaming up. So as you can see, there's been a lot of growth here in the polytunnel. Now normally it would look a lot more full than this because normally we have a lot of tomatoes in here, and I was going to plant this area up with other plants, but unfortunately none of the peppers germinated this year, so we got very few peppers and the beds are a lot more empty than they should be at this time of year. I'll show you the Tumbling Tom tomatoes first. They're down here on the left. These have been really struggling. The compost I've been using this year has been a little bit too acidic and there's not enough nitrogen, so these went completely yellow. I've now amended the soil and they've gone green again, but they're really not as big and lush as they should be. But as you can see, they're struggling a bit, but they're starting to come through now. We're getting some tomatoes. Hopefully with a bit of feed and maybe a repot into a larger pot, these will come through fine and we'll get a good harvest. At the back there you can see one of the butternut squash plants shooting along. These are the main ground cover in the polytunnel. You can see it looks like we might be getting our first fruit setting there. We'll see if it pollinates or not. The one behind it hasn't pollinated because it's gone a kind of yellowy colour already, but that one's already getting larger and looking green, so that's a good sign. We normally get a really good harvest of butternut squash in the end of the year. So here's the main polytunnel area. Now as I say, normally it would be full of tomatoes and all sorts of plants. This year we haven't done the tomatoes because of blight, but as you can see it's starting to green up quite nicely now. It's not as full as it would have been. I was hoping to grow extra food this year, but as I say, the peppers really didn't germinate well, so we had very small pepper crop, but everything's looking good otherwise. So on the left here we have the French beans. This variety is Cobra, and this has done really well. These always do really well for us. You can see some mottling here. That's probably red spider mite. We do get a touch of red spider mite sometimes on some of the plants in the polytunnel, which is a little bit surprising because it is a very humid environment and normally it's a drier greenhouse that gets red spider mite, but we do find we get a little bit here and there in the polytunnel. Fortunately with the humid conditions it doesn't normally become too big an issue and kill the plants, it just weakens them slightly. But this is the Cobra beans anyway, doing really well, climbing up nicely. I should probably try and start putting in some extra support soon. I might make them go that direction or maybe over this way, over this kind of production area, because this production area doesn't really get used much at this time of year. This is mainly just for spring and all the young plants, so we can move the beans over there, climb them over the top. But these are looking good, loads of flowers. We're starting to get a bit of a harvest as well, so these will crop really heavily for most of the summer. Sometimes you get a bit of problems with mold and botrytis eating off the leaves and fungus. This year so far so good. Hopefully we don't get too many humidity problems, but it's looking quite good at the moment. You can see a little bit on one of the leaves there, but generally this year it's been quite good. Then coming into the middle bed here, what you can see on the ground is our ground cover. So normally what we would have is lots of tomato plants growing, and then on the ground we'd have the butternut squash as a ground cover, but there's no tomatoes this year, so we'll probably actually get a better harvest of butternut squash than we would normally because they're not being shaded out by the tomatoes, and the tomatoes' roots aren't sucking out all the water and the nutrients. So these are looking really good. Nice big healthy plants. We haven't got any fruit yet, but here in Scotland it doesn't really normally ripen until really late in the season. So we normally get a lot of growth around about now, which is July. It keeps growing really well into August. They then start to set fruit in late August, and early September we get a harvest. And by October the plants stop growing and we harvest the very last of the fruits. Normally what we would do is we would have the tomato plants. They grow up, do relatively well until about August time. Come August it gets a bit cooler, and come September it's too cold for them. They tend to get lots of blight. They succumb to the blight. We then strip all the leaves off, and then that gives the light for the butternut squash to ripen, as that's the perfect time of year for them to ripen. So you'll see quite a lot of butternut squash around all the ground areas, and eventually the whole lot of this polytunnel by the end of the season should look like this, just one massive patch of butternut squash. So on the right hand side here we've got the strawberries. They finished fruiting. What we probably need to do is get some different varieties so we can prolong the harvest, but these did really well this year, really heavy crops, so they're just kind of in their resting phase at the moment, and then once the weather cools down a bit they'll send out loads of runners which they can then use to propagate future crops. You can see there are some runners already, but it's really when the cooler weather comes that the runners really start shooting out. You can see there another butternut squash plant which is going to grow along and fill the rest of this bed. We've got some chilies here. These are dwarf chilies, so these are the Apache chilies. these are really hot and you can get really heavy harvest in a small space. Now these were badly attacked by aphids early on, so these have been a little bit stunted. That's why we haven't got much crop at the moment, but we have been harvesting a few chilies already, so we're already getting the harvest. And then at the back we got some piri piri chilies, which are much bigger plants, and they'll be providing a heavy crop of chilies later on in the season. Then coming down here, I think this is a cucumber plant. We've got some more butternut squash, and then on the left we've got quite a busy bed. This is more what the rest of the polytunnel normally looks like, with plants right up to the ceiling. This is the cucumber plant, so I've made this structure on a previous video, and it's climbing up and it will soon reach the top and then probably start coming over the path as well. Cucumbers always do really well for us. They tend to grow a lot in the first few months, so May, June, and now we're coming into July, not crop much, and then once July comes and the weather gets really hot, they just crop constantly. So you can see we've got some cucumbers starting to crop, and to be honest, at this stage of the year until probably September time, there's just so many cucumbers we can't eat them all, and we're just kind of overflowing with cucumbers. So we make pickles and all sorts. You can see some more there, so that we can have cucumber stored for later in the year, and we can use the glut of cucumbers that we get. I particularly like the pickled ones because it's very much like gherkins. Then along in this bed as well, we've got the sweetcorn patch. Sweetcorn's not done quite as well this year as usual. Normally I would expect a bit more height to the plant, but that might be a good thing. We'll just wait and see. Hopefully the ears are going to get pollinated and we'll get a good set on the cobs. The cobs at the moment are looking a little thin. I'm hoping that we have got decent pollination. We'll just have to wait and see, but this year doesn't look as good as previous years. There is one or two big ones like that one over there and that one there, and each plant seems to have about two, but they are a bit smaller than previous years, so it doesn't look like it's going to be the best year for sweetcorn, but it's still going to be a reasonable harvest, I think. And it's July at the moment, so they are doing quite well with the warm temperatures. The only thing we do get with this is the pollen that falls off. We do shake it to make sure it pollinates the cobs lower down, but we tend to get a lot of mold building up, and that kind of reduces the photosynthetic rate. What we probably should be doing is wiping this down with a damp cloth, take off the pollen and stop the mold from forming. So what we tend to do is, once they finish casting all the pollen, we cut the male part of the flower off as it's dropped all its pollen, and that just kind of cuts down some of the mold, because this whole thing will start going moldy later on. You can see there's already a little bit of mold forming on that section there. And we keep the height of the plant. Even when the plants start to die, we harvest the corn, we keep them in place, and that's just a climbing structure for the cucumbers here to come across, and also for the butternut squash to grow up into. So you can see already there's a cucumber plant here which is already using this as a trellis and growing through, and by the end of the year it will be covered. We also do have a weird weed that's come up this year. I'm not too sure what it is. It looks a bit like millet or something, so we'll be removing that probably, because it looks quite a bit like sweetcorn when it was first growing, which is probably why we didn't weed it out. It's some big kind of tropical style grass, so that definitely needs to be taken out before it sets seed everywhere. And then down on the right hand side here, this was a pepper bed. It's a bit overgrown at the moment, unfortunately. I was hoping the peppers would get a bit more height before the butternut squash will start shading them out. The other problem is we planted some dwarf beans, but these dwarf beans, they're really not very dwarf. They're quite large actually for dwarf beans. You can see here it's like a large bush bean, and these have been cropping fantastically. We've got loads of beans off them. They'll keep cropping probably for another month. We'll then take them out, give more space for the peppers, but we have been getting a few peppers already and harvesting them. You can see there's one just down there behind all that foliage, and there's been a reasonable crop considering how swamped they are. I see a few more chilies as well growing on there, but relatively happy with the peppers considering how smothered they are. I think some of these are the jalapenos. You can see the jalapenos down there, so not too bad. But certainly once the beans start to go over, we need to get these bush beans out and get the peppers some more space. And these again were attacked badly with aphids. As you can see, there's kind of crinkled leaves, but the newer leaves are coming through healthy now. The aphids seem to have been dealt with, so that's good. What we did, if you just let the doors open a few days when it was warmer weather, let the hoverflies come in and other beneficial insects, and they've dealt with the aphids. My mum also made up a spray of soap and bicarbonate of soda to spray them, and that also helped to clear them up. So coming along to the left here, we've got the melons. We've got a mixture of melons and butternut squash starting to climb up here. Ideally we want the butternut squash to stay down and climb over the sweetcorn here. This is more for the melons. We don't want the melons getting crowded out, but they're not really cropping yet. And I'm not sure how they're going to do, to be honest, because we've never grown melons here before, and even in a polytunnel here in Scotland, it's hard to get the temperatures high enough for the melons to really grow at their best. So we've got quite a bit of decent growth coming on them. Leaves are quite small, but that's kind of more common for melon plants. But we do have a lot of flowers, but none of them are setting properly. So loads of flowers, no fruit setting yet, but hopefully with the heat wave coming later this week, it might start setting some fruit, put on a bit more growth as well, because this would ideally be completely covered. So see how the melons do. There's always a bit of an experiment. Without extreme heat, the melons really do suffer. The main problem is not the daytime temperatures, because in here it can get up to 30-40 degrees Celsius on a hot sunny day. But at night time it still gets down to 10 or 12 degrees. It's really the night temperatures are a bit cold for it, so that's probably why this is struggling. Coming around here, we've got a few more plants, but it's, as I say, not as full as it should be. We've got some remaining lettuce plants. The rest of them have been harvested. A butternut squash which has been really struggling. I think the reason for that is behind this part of the polytunnel there's a large Leylandii hedge, and it sucks up loads of water, loads of nutrients, so the soil in this part of the polytunnel is the worst. So I think that's why that's a bit stunted. That's also why the courgette here is also stunted. We've got a small basil plant, another courgette. We've got I think this is called ice lemon, or it's like a yellow type of cucumber, just quite different to your normal cucumbers. Coming along, we've got this beetroot that I was worried about in the previous update that were too smothered, they weren't doing well. These have started to take off. What we do need to do is a little bit of weeding around here, but it looks like we'll get a reasonable crop of beetroot. They won't be the best, they are a bit small, but you can see one or two are getting a nice size now. That's probably ready for harvesting actually, so probably can harvest that soonish. Again, some more courgette plants which are just starting to crop. On the left here you can get a good display of all the flowers from the cucumber plants, which are growing up nicely. As I say, there'll be non-stop cucumbers from them soon. Another courgette plant which is just starting to get some of the first courgettes. These normally get absolutely huge when they get going, so they're a bit slow to get started, but once they get going they get absolutely huge. And then finishing off the final bit of the polytunnel here, we've got the Insetti banana and some more strawberries. The Insetti banana, I'm not going to eat it. You can eat it, but it's not really grown as an edible crop. It's just a curiosity that I'm growing it for. We've got a couple of cuttings down the bottom there of some basil plants as well. So I'll now take you outside and show you how the outside garden's doing. It looks a lot better than here in the polytunnel, where things are a little bit behind this year and not doing quite as well. Now unfortunately it's still raining outside, so I thought I'd give you a quick tour of the greenhouse, which is doing much better than the polytunnel. This is normally what the polytunnel would look like at this time of year. Loads of tomatoes, about 6 foot in height, absolutely covered in flowers and just starting to crop. So we've had a relatively good success here in the greenhouse. As I say, previously what we've been having is a lot of blight affecting the tomatoes in the polytunnel, which is why we've stopped growing them this year, and we're just growing them in the greenhouse this year to stop the blight cycle, and also because we know we get a relatively good harvest here in the greenhouse. So they're doing quite well. As you can see, there's quite a lot of fruit starting to set on some of the trusses down here. The thing with Scotland is the climate's quite cold, so you might get a lot of fruit setting, but it can take quite a long time for them to ripen up. From the flowers setting until the fruit are ready, it can be about a month. For the cherry tomatoes, it can be 2 or 3 months for the beefsteak tomatoes. So we tend not to grow beefsteak tomatoes, we just do the cherry tomatoes or salad tomatoes, because the other ones just take too long. There's a real mixture in here. This is mainly Sun Gold on the right, which is a really sweet, tasty cherry tomato. You can just about see a couple of ripe ones at the end there. They're more of an orange colour, but they're really, really tasty tomato. I'd say probably the tastiest tomato I've ever had. So that's the Sun Gold variety down there. We've also got, I think it's Elsa Craig, which is like a salad tomato, just more like your typical tomato. So these are them here. They're looking quite good. Don't think any of these are quite ripe yet. We've got some ones down here which are looking pretty good, decent size, so they'll be ripening in the next few weeks, but none of them quite ripe yet. And underneath I did an undercropping of coriander, and the coriander's done really well. You can't really see much at the moment because a lot's been harvested and also lots gone to seed, but you can see a few leaves are left down the bottom there. But if I come up higher up, you'll see more of a scale of the coriander. You can see all the white flowers here. These are all white flowers from the coriander plants. So I'll let them go to seed. We can harvest the seed, use that for cooking, or we can plant the seeds again and we can have another crop of coriander later in the year. So coriander's done well underneath the tomatoes with a bit of shading. You just grow a little bit longer before they go to seed. And then at the end there we've got the lemon verbena, which has already been cut back several times and is already getting close to 6 foot in height, so it's doing quite well. And as for the tomatoes, they've been doing quite well, as I say. I need to do a little bit more pruning today maybe. They always need a lot of pruning, otherwise they just grow into a straggly mess. If you're in a hot country or subtropical country, then you can get away with not pruning your tomatoes and let them grow as a big mess and they'll still crop quite well. But here in Scotland you really need to focus all the energy into fruiting. So if I let all the side branches grow on these, they'll put a lot of energy into their foliage and they wouldn't put a lot of energy into flowering, and by the end of the season we wouldn't really get a lot of harvest. So it's quite important to prune your tomatoes. If you're interested in how to do it, I've done a video about that in the past and I'll leave a link in the video description so you can find that. But basically, with most tomatoes you need to cut out all the side growths that come out between the stem and the leaf. Unless it's a bush tomato, such as this poorly looking one here, and then you leave the bush ones unpruned. This bush one has actually got a little bit of blight forming, so I'll be taking this out. You can see the mould on the stem there. That's what the blight looks like. It then kills back the stem and the whole plant will eventually die. So I'll be taking that out because I definitely don't want the blight from that spreading to the rest of the tomatoes. But fortunately, the rest of them look quite good. And if we do get any blight, I will just remove some of the leaves to get better airflow in here and stop that blight from spreading any further. And the only other plants we have in here are the butternut squash, so they're right at the end. They haven't grown a huge amount in here because they're competing with the tomatoes. You can see there's one there, and there's actually another one down here, which is hard to see. These will grow quite slowly, but by the end of summer they will completely cover the ground. And towards the end of summer, as we're dealing with the blight and we're giving more light to the ripening tomatoes, we'll remove a lot of the leaves from the tomato plants. That will give a lot more light for the butternut squash underneath, and then we'll get a good crop of butternut squash in here. Now the reason we grow so much butternut squash is because it works well with other plants, because you can grow it as a ground cover, smothers the weeds and doesn't interfere too much with the taller plants like the tomatoes. And the other reason we like it so much is because you can get a massive harvest, and that big harvest will last so long. With a lot of the plants we grow, like the tomatoes, once they're ripe you really need to pick them quite early to make the most of that crop, or you need to preserve them because they won't last for long. But with the butternut squash they can last for many months. In the right conditions they can last all winter, especially if you get the winter squash that stores really well. They've got thick skins with a lot of wax on the outside and they just store for months and months in somewhere that's cool. That's why we like to grow lots of butternut squash. They keep really well and they're great for eating and cooking with. So hopefully the rain's going to ease off soon. Once it does, I'll take you outside and show you how much everything's been growing outdoors and tell you a bit about the weather we've had recently. So this is what I would call a pretty typical Scottish day, of what I would think traditionally of what Scottish weather would be like. Now in more recent years we get a lot of dry weather, a lot of warmer weather, but certainly when I was growing up in the part of Scotland I used to be in, most days were like this. Today is only 13 degrees Celsius, even though it's the middle of July. It's kind of damp. It's not heavy rain, it's just very light drizzle, a lot of thick clouds, maybe a little bit of sun every now and again, but generally dark, grey, overcast skies. Just what I would think typically what Scottish weather would be like. But we haven't had any of this weather recently. This is quite a contrast to what we have had. We did have a heat wave last weekend, so normally the temperatures here in this part of Scotland, the maximum average daily temperature in July is 18 degrees Celsius, so some days you'll have 15-16 degrees, some days you'll have 20-21 degrees, but it will average out as a maximum each day about 18 degrees Celsius, and minimum should be about 10 or 8 degrees Celsius at night time. But this year it's been quite a bit warmer, and last weekend we actually had 26 degrees here, so that was really quite warm, quite unusual. And that warm weather has been good, but we have had to irrigate quite a lot. It has been really quite dry this year, so we've had to be doing a lot of irrigation, and there's a few disease problems that are starting to crop up. We're mostly keeping on top of them, and I'll show you a couple of things that the dry weather's been doing, and also show you the plants that have been doing well and other ones that haven't been doing as well. So I'll probably take you over first to the allium plot over here. This is the most bare at the moment because we just had a nice harvest of onions, and I'll now go show you the onions that we've already harvested. They were just from this plot here where you can see a lot of bare earth at the moment. So these are the onions that have been harvested. Now there was a lot more. We've already used probably 30 or 40 onions already, but you can see here nice harvest of onions, decent size. We have had a bit of problem with white mold recently. This is a disease which is quite common in onions, and it just causes the outside skins to go moldy. You have to make sure they're very well dried. We also had to harvest them a bit earlier. You can see here, this one for example, that white mold at the bottom. If that's lead, that will spread and the whole onion will go rotten. So we've had to harvest a bit earlier than we would have. We have got some reasonable sized onions. I'm 6'5", so my hands aren't great for scale, but you can see that's a really nice large one there. Normally most of onions are probably around about this size here. This year the average is a bit smaller because we harvested them a bit earlier, but it's still a good crop this year. You can see some of these smaller ones my parents have harvested recently because they're a bit worried about the white mold, so it's a bit of a shame we've had to harvest them so early, but we should normally have them, as I say, around about this size, and normally we do get a good crop of onions. You can see there's some more down here which have already fully dried and are looking quite good for using. So in the space where the onions were, half of that has now been planted up with leeks. You can just see the very small leek seedlings. These aren't going to get into giant leeks because we're too late in the year for that now. It should have been planted in June, but we'll get a small harvest of leeks from this patch. Over here are the leeks that were planted at the correct time. These are much bigger. They're actually almost ready for earthing up again. We earth up the leeks. The reason being is if you don't earth them up, you're just left with lots of green stem. But where you cover them up with the soil, the stem goes white and you get that nicer flavoured leek for it. But if you earth them up too quickly and you get soil in between the leaves, that's when you get gritty leeks. So you have to be quite careful when you earth them up. If you earth them up too early, you get gritty leaves and you get all that soil inside the leek, which isn't nice. But if you don't earth them up enough, you just get a tiny white section and the rest is all leaves and it's not as much edible. So we'll probably earth them up quite soon. We've also got a nice row of French marigolds. These went in quite recently, so they're not doing too well. And to be honest, French marigolds in this part of Scotland, they don't do too well early summer. But when we get the warm weather here in July and early August, they'll really perk up. So by the end of August, these French marigolds will be looking quite good. We've also got one or two of these opium poppies that we've left. As I say, we let them grow every now and again if they self-seed because they look really nice. This is a really nice variety. We don't even know where it's come from. It's just self-seeded one year and we just liked it so much with that black cross, the bright red flowers and the frilly edges that we let it self-seed every now and again. It makes these big beautiful plants, and then we just keep some of the seed heads for the seeds next year. As I say, we don't normally need to sow too many because they tend to self-seed quite well. There is a purple one as well that pops up every now and again. You can see that's over there. So it tends to be red, but every now and again we get the purple one as well. I personally prefer the red one. Now this section down here, we're probably going to plant up with lettuce because we don't really have much lettuce crop at the moment. Over there you can see the potatoes I planted in a previous video. They've come up great, covering the ground and smothering off all the weeds. Then around this section we've got some nasturtiums. They always self-seed every year. We just kind of let them spread. They're quite good at luring in the cabbage white butterflies, which lay their eggs on these plants instead of the cabbages. And they also have really nice flowers. You can see these kind of all cross-pollinate with each other, so there's lots of different flowers every year. They seem to be a different colour. So you can see we've got a nice cream one there, and then we've got kind of a more fiery red one over in this section over here. Now there's not many flowers at the moment. The reason being because we've got really rich soil here for the vegetables, and when you have rich soil the nasturtiums grow lots of leaves, but we also eat the leaves as salad because they're really nice peppery leaves, very similar to rocket. So we'll be harvesting these as a salad leaf, so that's another reason we like them to self-seed and grow. Get a lovely salad leaf, and then towards the end of the season when most of the nitrogen's been taken out of the soil and the plants are getting a bit more mature, they'll be absolutely covered in flowers and this will look really, really nice. So this section here was supposed to be a few radishes and lots of spinach, but the spinach must have been some old seed and not a single seed germinated despite me putting a really heavy crop of spinach seed. So we've got a few radishes left. You can see this section here, they're just starting to go to seed. This whole section was covered in radishes, but we've harvested the rest of them. That's all that's left. So we need to clear the weeds from this soon, put another batch of radish and maybe some spinach as well. And we've also got a courgette plant, although that one's really struggling because it's kind of out-competed. We also have this other plant which always self-seeds all the time, which is borage. We just let it self-seed because it's quite nice ornamental. You can see the flowers are quite nice, and we add the flowers to salads just to add a little bit of colour. You can also eat the leaves, but they're really rough and hairy, and so they're not very nice to be honest. But the flowers you like to harvest and just add them to salads for a little bit of colour. That's another thing we do with the nasturtiums as well. The nasturtiums, their nice flowers are edible, so we sometimes also add them to salads. So it's ornamental and edible at the same time, which is quite a nice thing to have. So you can have a nice looking garden, which is also edible. And that's another nice thing with the tree spinach here. You get that fantastic colour from the new buds, really vibrant kind of purple colour. So they look really, really nice. And these will easily reach 8 feet, 9 feet by the end of the season if we don't cut them back too much. So whilst I'm at this end, I'll also talk about the raspberries. Now we don't really normally irrigate these much, partly because there's normally enough rain, but also because we don't want to waste the water, because a lot of the water that we would irrigate on this would go up into the willows. Most years it's not a problem having the thirsty willows right next to the raspberries, because the raspberries like a bit of the shade because they're more of a woodland plant, and normally there's enough rain that the willows don't suck up too much water. But this year the raspberries have really suffered, so we do irrigate the plots here. We don't irrigate the lawns or anything like that, or the rest of the garden. It's just a vegetable plot to make sure we get the maximum yield. But here the raspberries have really struggled. You can see this year they're quite small, so we've got the new growth still growing. That should get a bit taller, but I would expect it to be a bit higher by now. Normally it gets right up here. You can see some of them are getting close to 6.5 foot tall, and some of them last year were about 7 foot tall. So they've struggled a bit, and it's the same with the fruit. The fruits really struggle with the dry weather. We had a lot of fruit just very small and green like this, wasn't doing anything. We got a good soak of rain a couple of weeks ago, and then some of them started to fatten up and turn red, but these are much smaller than they should be. They're normally 2 or 3 times the size of this, so it's a pretty bad crop of raspberries this year, but it's not the end of the world because we have such a big raspberry plot. We're still going to get loads of raspberries. It's just not quite as much as normal, so maybe we won't be having as much excess for jam and things like that as we would normally, but we'll get another crop in autumn, and hopefully that'll be a bit better when it's a bit cooler, and hopefully the soil will be damper by then. So I'll take you around to the last bit of the allium plot, and that's just the onions that were planted a bit too late. These will be a bit small. Unfortunately they're already flopping over as if they're ready for harvesting, so I'll probably have to harvest these in the next few weeks. So onions haven't been as good as normal this year. Hopefully that white mold from the onion doesn't affect the leeks. It can do, they're in the same family, so we'll just have to keep an eye on that. Some of the leeks are more resistant to it than others, so I'm hoping, fingers crossed, we'll be okay. We have actually got quite a bad infection as well on the garlic. The garlic's been taken out, we've already harvested that. We had to harvest that a bit early because of the infection that it was getting with the white mold, so that's gone. So we'll see how this does, but we'll probably plant this up with something later in the year, probably something like spinach or lettuce, some kind of salad crop that will keep us into autumn. And down here you can also see this is a nasturtium. This is more what they look like towards the end of the year when they're struggling a bit more. I think this one we've harvested a lot of the leaves, so it's been a bit stressed. We've harvested a lot of the leaves on this one just because we don't want it kind of taking over the onions. So you can see it's going into flower. That's more what they would look like normally. Then down here, this is where the garlic was, which is now just bare soil. We might plant something up here, but we'll probably just let the pumpkins out. You can see one growing here start to spread along and cover that patch, and we'll just keep a thin path down the section here. But this is that low maintenance, basically zero maintenance garden that I talked about earlier, where you have an undercropping of pumpkins or butternut squash, and then you have the Jerusalem artichokes, which is the main harvest, and you have them as a root harvest. So you harvest the tubers from these, and these will be harvested all winter long. These grow really tall. They can grow up to about 9-10 feet in total. We won't let them grow this tall here because it's so windy, the wind will blow them over. So what I'll be doing soon is I'll be cutting the tops off, making them branch out more so we get shorter, more branched plants, which will be able to cope with the wind a bit better. But because they're such big vigorous plants, they grow up fast, they don't really worry about the weeds. And then at the ground level, any weeds that do come through, they'll be quickly smothered by the pumpkin plants. And as this was a potato patch last year, we didn't get every single last potato out, so there's also quite a few potatoes coming up now, so they'll also help smother out the weeds, but also give us another root harvest. So whilst I'm talking about the wind on this, I'm going to say the wind this year has been really bad. It's been much windier than normal. We've been having 40-50 mile an hour gusts quite regularly, which is unusual for July time. Normally July is the calmest month here. Today's nice and calm, but it has been quite stormy recently. Now there hasn't been too much damage. I think some of the onions flopping over probably was the wind damage. And you can see the eucalyptus here lost every single leaf in spring, and it's just starting to regrow. It's got that kind of reactive growth that it gets after a wildfire. So all along the stems there you can see all the old branches have died off from the wind, and the new foliage is coming through, but it is even now still struggling because we are getting quite strong winds still. We don't get it as bad in July, even if we do get strong winds, because we do have all the willow now, which is forming a great wind barrier, and also some of the other plants in the outside area. But generally it is quite bad here for wind, so we need to make sure that these are protected. We've also got a perpetual rocket here, which I'll be making a video about soon to talk about how fantastic it is. This rocket is perennial, it lasts for several years. You just constantly harvest it. It's not like the annual rocket, which once it goes to seed you can't use it. So this plot's doing quite well. As you can see with the cardboard and the mulch, it's kept most of the weeds down. Any weeds that do come through will get smothered by the other plants. As I say, the things like pumpkins in there, we haven't really grown pumpkins outside in this part of Scotland before. Our climate's a little bit too cold for it. So we'll see how they do. They might struggle a bit, especially as they'll be a bit shaded, but we'll see what happens at the end of the year, see if we get a good crop or not. We've also got some courgettes in here as well, and I did plant a row of tree spinach, which you can see is starting to come through now, and this will just make a really tall backdrop at the end of the garden here. It's also got another nice feature, apart from the lovely colours that you get on the new buds there, is you get this kind of nice, kind of like a weird mini, I don't know if it's very small hairs or what it is, or if it's kind of waxy covering. I don't think it's waxy, it feels more like small hairs, but you can see you've got this lovely waterproof leaves, and they just have loads of nice beads. So it's quite an ornamental plant, as I say, really unusual one. And then this last corner is some potatoes that we just left grow, and we'll be harvesting these in the next few days, and these will be a nice crop of salad potatoes. So this time of year, this is when the harvest really starts to kick in. From probably about April until June, that's probably the leanest time for us for our vegetable garden, because all the stored vegetables that we've been storing over winter have been used up or are starting to go off, and the next crop of harvest isn't ready yet. But now we're harvesting quite heavily. As I say, we've had onions, we're getting lots of beans and peas, and we're also getting a lot of brassica crops now as well, which I'll show you as we go around. I'll show you one unusual crop which technically should be edible, but this variety has a lot of hard seeds in it. This is a Musa sicumensis, which is a type of banana which you can eat, but it's full of seeds, so it's not really very edible. This might look unusual considering I'm so far north and our climate is so cold, but this comes from very high up in the Himalayan mountains, so it's used to cold temperatures and probably only around 20 degrees during the day, and it can handle some slight frosts in the winter as well. This garden is quite close to the sea, so although there's very hard frost where I live of -15, here they don't get much below -5, so this will be absolutely fine here as long as we keep it well mulched, and we normally put about a foot of mulch around the base of it to protect the roots. The top half dies every year, but the roots survive. I grew this one from seed, and out of all the ones I grew from seed, this has been the best growing so far. And one of the nice features of this is it has these lovely stripes on the leaves, really nice ornamental plant. I'm not growing it for food, but if we ever do get bananas, that's just going to be a bonus. So it's really unusual, nice to see it growing, and we'll see how big it gets. This is only the second year it's been growing, so it's only just over a year in age. It's probably only about a year and 4 months, so by the end of this summer it should be really quite tall, quite an impressive sight. So I'll now take you to the legume patch. This is the peas and beans. We've got lots of self-seeded sunflowers which we've left. These are all from a variety that I've been kind of breeding myself. I'm breeding two varieties, one in my garden which is a giant branch variety which is going to grow like a tree, and the one in my parents' garden is very branched but it's smaller, and so it's more wind resistant. You can see this is the kind of one I'm going for. It's still very variable, so some of them are still growing tall and thin. I have also got a tall, narrow orange one that I grow as well in this garden, which is probably what this one's come from. But you can see this is the variety I'm going for. Slightly smaller leaves, really thick stem, lots of branching, but not too much height. So in the peas and beans section, these peas have really done badly. I don't know what happened with them. Partly was badly attacked by pigeons. They've not grown well, not cropped at all barely, and they've almost completely died out. So I need to sow another crop of them. But the Mons too have done great and have actually grown much taller than I was expecting. They're getting close to about 7 foot in height now. So you can see here, nice big plants. Lots and lots of peas. Although these were listed as Mons too, they're growing a bit more like a sugar snap pea. You can see they're quite fat pods. So I'm not sure they were listed correctly in the shop. So we've just been using them more like a sugar snap pea. But you can see good height, lots of flowers. And the other thing I like about this variety is this colour. Really attractive flowers on them. The other peas tend to have a kind of creamy white flower. These have a lovely purple flower. So I'm really happy with them. When it comes to the other legumes in this patch, we've got the broad beans here. They were planted far too late this year, so they're a bit smaller than they should be. But they're not doing too bad. They are a dwarf variety, so that's why they're not very tall. Normally these get to about 5 foot or so in height. This year they're lots more like a dwarf variety, and they were planted too late. But you can see lots of beans coming on them, so we're going to get a really nice heavy crop of dwarf beans. We'll harvest them, and we'll see if we can get a second cropping. Sometimes with dwarf beans, once you harvest the first crop, if you cut them back, they might have a bit more energy and they might regrow. You might get a second crop later in the year. So we'll see how they do, but they are doing really nice at the moment. As you can see, loads of beans, despite the height that they've grown. it looks like we'll get a nice heavy crop from them. And the supports for them, although we've made them quite tall, these beans have stayed very small. I do need to start cutting back some of the foliage on this. We don't want the willow to set too many roots, because then it sucks up all the water and nutrients and then it'll start stunting the plants. So I'll be cutting off all the branches on these now just to stunt them, and I'll show you the ones on the right hand side here where the runner beans are that I did previously. So these ones here were really bushy. I stripped all the leaves off and they've regrown, but I'm just keeping them under control so they don't get too big. These are just willow stakes from the willow. We don't really want them to grow, but if they do, it's not the end of the world. A little bit of extra shelter at this time of year is quite beneficial with these strong winds. But as I say, we will cut the leaves back regularly, stop them getting too big. Now, runner beans have been really bad this year. Normally, we'd probably have them up about 6 foot in height by now. We wouldn't normally be harvesting them by now, because runner beans in Scotland, they don't really like the cooler weather at the beginning of the year. So if you plant them out too early, they can get stunted in June when we get some colder nights still. But once they get going at the end of June, beginning of July, they grow so fast they kind of make up for it. And then they start cropping really heavy in August. And although we just get a late crop, kind of late August, early September, they crop so heavy at that point, it makes up for the short growing season. So these are just starting to take off now. As I say, they would be a lot bigger by now, but the first crop I sowed was old seed. Not a single seed germinated, so we had to sow another set of seeds, and these have germinated and are starting to do well. So they're starting to shoot up. They do tend to be a bit slow when they get going, and if you have a lot of wind like we have recently, they kind of stay kind of stocky and grow more like a bush bean. But then once they get going and they start climbing like this, they will just shoot up. And with the heat wave that we're having this weekend, they should hopefully really take off and start covering the structure. And by the next update, you'll probably see most of the structure covered. And by the end of the year, this will be a wall of beans cropping really nice and heavily. So that's all the legumes in this patch. We do have some root vegetables as well. So we have the parsnips here. They always take a long time to germinate, but once they get going, they grow really fast and they get absolutely huge. And with the cool climate that we have here, the parsnips do really well. We also have really deep sandy topsoil, which is what they really like to grow those really big deep roots. So we'll get a massive crop of parsnips. They will grow for a long time. It's a long growing season. So it's July now and they're getting nice and leafy. There'll be really big leaves for the whole summer, and it won't probably be until October, November that we harvest them. And then we'll continue harvesting right through the winter as these stay really well in the soil. And that's a nice, really good winter crop that we can harvest right until spring. So we like to grow quite a few parsnips when we can. And it's the same with the carrots. The carrots will last in the ground until springtime. You see the carrots are coming along here. That's another plant that does really well in our climate. It likes the cool weather. They are a little stunted at the moment. We let the weeds grow up a bit too much. So we need to take that other mini tunnel off, weed it, let the carrots have a bit more space. But once they get a bit more space, these are going to really take off. And they should do quite well. And at the corner here we have another courgette. This is actually doing the best out of all our courgettes, which is unusual because normally the courgettes outside are about 4 times smaller than the ones we grow in the polytunnel because they don't like the cold temperatures out here. But the last couple of weeks it's been much warmer than average, so they've done really well. And if we do get this heat wave at the weekend, these will really take off. We should get a really nice harvest. You can see, in fact, this one is already just about ready for harvesting. So I'll now take you on to the last plot. That's the Brassica plot. It's been a bit of a mixed success this year. Normally we have fantastic results with our Brassicas. We do have a lot of diseases we have to deal with. We can normally keep them all under control. The main ones are clubroot and cabbage root fly. We keep them controlled by having crop rotation, making sure we sow them in sterile soil at the beginning of the year, and also keeping the ground nice and alkaline so that it stops the clubroot. And then for the root fly, we keep everything mulched, and we often put collars around the stems as well to stop the little fly from laying its eggs. And then we also have it in the cage. That's for the pigeons, because the pigeons would absolutely decimate this and eat them all. And also the cabbage butterfly would come in, lay its eggs, and the cabbage butterfly caterpillars would completely strip the plants. So we've protected against that. But we do have a lot of white blister this year, which is a fungal leaf disease. It's kind of hard to deal with. We don't want to use fungicide or anything, so we've just been picking off any of the infected leaves, keeping it under control, but it is something that might become a problem later in the year. Luckily it's been quite dry weather, so that's kind of kept it at bay, but if we do get some more damp conditions, that could be a problem going forwards. So we've got some more brassicas in here. I think these are mainly cabbages. Kind of hard to show because it's covered in water, so the mesh is not very see-through at the moment, but I'll show you the ones indoors. So as I say, these have been doing really well, not quite as well as normal because we got a bit of white blister and I planted them much later than I should have, but they've kind of caught up and they're doing quite well. We also have a nice little crop of lettuce down here for some salad. Now we've harvested most of the early crop already, so this whole kind of empty section at the side there, that was all kohlrabi. That's all been harvested. See if I can see any other ones left. I think we've harvested them all, so they're finished. But the kohlrabi is really good early crop. We'll be replacing them with kale. I'll actually be planting up some kale today so we have something for the winter. We've also been harvesting loads of broccoli. I don't think I can see any really large broccoli heads left. We've harvested all the first lot of broccoli heads, so we've got all these kind of secondary heads that come up. We tend to harvest the first big head, which is like the ones you get in the shop, the Calabrese broccoli, and then it will just send up all these new sprouts, which we can use as a sprouting broccoli. So broccoli's been harvesting really well. So has the Tuscany kale. We've been harvesting this constantly. You can see at the moment there's not a huge amount of leaf on it because we've harvested so much. We've also harvested some cauliflower as well. I think there's not much this year. I can't see any other cauliflower. I can see more broccoli here and there. And then when it comes to cabbages, we've got this early summer cabbage, which we should be able to harvest in a few weeks' time. And then we've got that giant cabbage over there, which will be more winter time. This is supposed to be one of the biggest types of cabbages in the world, so we'll see how big it gets. Hasn't been planted early enough to get to its record-breaking size, but it should do quite well. You can see the size of the leaves on these are absolutely enormous, huge leaves. Again, I'm 6'5", so my hand's not a good scale comparison, but really big leaves, doing well. You can see it's not even hearting up yet because it's such a giant variety. It will just grow massive leaves for most of the summer, and then right towards the end of the summer it will start hearting up and we'll get a massive cabbage head much bigger than you would a normal cabbage. You can see down here as a size comparison, this is more of a normal cabbage size. This one's just starting to heart up, and that will heart up fully within 2 or 3 weeks and be a normal size, kind of football sized cabbage. Whereas these ones here with the giant leaves, these will start hearting up later in the season and be an absolutely giant cabbage, which will be really big, much bigger than a football. So it'll be interesting to see how they do. But that's about it for the vegetable tour. I'll see you guys in a few weeks' time. Everything should just be progressing along. There might be a few more empty sections as we're clearing things out. But what I'm going to try and do this year is try and do successional cropping. So as one plant gets harvested, we then put it in with a replacement plant. Now I have been very busy this year, so I've not actually done any work here myself for about a month now. It's just been my parents been looking after it, so we are a bit behind on a few things and things aren't quite as grown along as I would have liked them, but hopefully we'll catch up later this season. We are getting a lot of crop at the moment, maybe not quite as much as usual, but a reasonable crop, and we'll see how it is later in the season. Hopefully we'll get a really good harvest again. I just noticed there is actually one cauliflower, you can see down there, just about ready for harvesting now. And as I say, there was a few more cauliflowers, but you can see they've all been harvested. That was the section where they were. So I'll see you guys in a week or two's time, and we'll see how the garden's progressing.